Welcome to you all to the Institute of Commonwealth Studies and on this very pleasant afternoon in London. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Ananya Vajpeyi from the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi, which is one of India's oldest independent research institutions. It's been in existence for 62 years and one of the most respected in terms of its work in research, in social research, politics, humanities, social sciences. Ananya is going to talk to us today is a professor at the CSDS, and she's going to talk to us about Gandhi in this age of masculinity and majoritarianism, the signs of which are all around us. And I would also like to welcome all those who have joined us online today. Ananya is very much a interdisciplinarian or transdisciplinarian. She works on intellectual history, political theory, critical philology. We've done a lot of work on Sanskrit recently and has a long-term project on the life and ideas of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. And he's also currently a research consultant at the Nilgiri Archaeological Project at the University of Kent. How this will work is Ananya's lecture talk will be recorded, and we will have a discussion afterwards. And please keep your questions to the discussion period after the lecture. And the Q&A will not be recorded. So the recording will just be of the lecture. So it's me great pleasure to let Ananya start. Thank you.
I hope that I'm audible to those who are online. I assume I am. Yeah.
Yeah. If anybody's saying.
Hi. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Let me start then by thanking James and Institute for Commonwealth Studies for this very kind invitation. The Institute really reminds me of my own home institution, the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. We are also an institute for advanced study, essentially, and we're all dedicated research scholars, although some of us teach from time to time as well. So my subject today is revisiting Gandhi in the age of masculinity and majoritarianism. You're going to wonder why I'm talking about Gandhi at this time when who seems to have been completely forgotten. But I hope that it will become clear why it's important to actually revisit his ideas and his contribution. So a quick look at the top grossing films of Indian cinema in recent years, whether from the Hindi film industry or cinema of the southern languages like Tamil and Telugu, immediately reveals that Indian audiences seem to love hyper-masculine heroes with chiseled bodies and ripped muscles, weapons and gore, torture and cruelty, dystopian landscapes, discordant music, and apocalyptic narratives. Whether the theme is history or science fiction, fantasy or social realism, crime or family drama, there is a taste for extreme and graphic violence such as never seen before on the silver screen, at least not in India. From Shahid Kapoor's Kabir Singh to Ranbir Kapoor's Animal to Vicky Kaushal's Chhawa, these are all fairly recent films. Even the most sensitive lead actors with the softest faces and the best dance moves, who are, we are told in real life, devoted husbands, obedient sons, and adoring fathers, no longer hesitate to play killers and psychopaths. Storylines are contrived to allow these macho men to behave in aggressive and threatening ways, towards their leading ladies. Your typical blockbuster romance, which was in any way pretty sexist, and movie plots like real life, never strayed far from patriarchy. Now justified by convoluted backstories of childhood trauma and emotional scarring, misogyny and violence against women are normalized in the new Bollywood. But it isn't just popular culture where this kind of anger and aggression are glorified. Across the world, in countries and polities as diverse as India, the US, Brazil, Kenya, Tanzania, Poland, Turkey, Sweden, the ascendant ideologies of the religious right, whether Christian, Muslim, or Hindu, and the rise of populist and authoritarian governments together have a deleterious impact on gender equality, the rights of women and sexual minorities, and on feminist struggles for reproductive autonomy, sexual choice, safeguards against violence, and a range of related issues. It would seem that the common thread in such diverse settings is a reactionary return to patriarchal and misogynistic ideas and practices within different religious communities, together with a backlash against liberal, egalitarian, and progressive norms more generally, adversely affecting women and the LGBTQIA plus minorities across religious groups and nationalities. In the world's two largest and hitherto liberal democracies, India and the US, women are voting in numbers for charismatic strongmen and apparently share the conservative views of their male compatriots on sensitive issues like abortion, gay marriage, interreligious marriage, contraception, and so on. In Europe, the trend of women occupying the highest political offices has coincided with the rapid growth of the far right. Surely a coincidence that requires some explanation, even if the link between these two phenomena is not one of causality. This global backsliding of the sexual revolution is undoubtedly the result of a lethal combination of religious fundamentalism and populist majoritarianism that currently dominates the world order. Even countries with a track record of well-developed secularism, of whatever stripe, both in the North and the South, are not immune from the reassertion of religious reaction when it comes to gender and sexuality. This is a serious problem for feminists everywhere. The question before us is, are all religions intrinsically patriarchal? If this were the case, then how come we have for the most part made progress in securing better rights and greater equity for women in the past century, regardless of the religious environment in which they live? Most religions teach, if not absolute equality of the sexes, then at least an ideal of justice, which prohibits the outright persecution of the weak, including women and children. Besides this, since the Enlightenment, every major religious tradition has undergone a process of reform and revision, not just in the West, but also in complex, multi-religious and old societies like those in India, Turkey, and Japan. While modernization, secularization, and in some cases the impact of radical left political ideologies, starting from Marxism and communism, was to minimize, limit, or obviate the role of religion both in the functioning of the state and in the lives of men and women, religions themselves have not remained static or hidebound either, and have incorporated progressive ideas about gender, among other things, within their doctrines in response to historical circumstances. Secularism and atheism have provided avenues for dissenters to opt out of hardline religious identities, at least in some societies. In Mao's China, the state violently and forcibly purged religion from public life through the so-called Cultural Revolution, not to mention the re-education or indoctrination of elites. In India and Turkey, the founding fathers of the two modern republics in the 20th century, Jawaharlal Nehru and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, respectively, were insistent that secularism be the norm governing the relationship between religion and the state. This seems to have led to a reaction in both countries, with majoritarian strongmen like Narendra Modi from the Hindu right and Recep Tayyip Erdogan from the Islamic right taking over power in the 21st century, albeit through substantial electoral victories for their respective political parties, the BJP and the AKP, as well as their personal popularity with the masses. Now, in his classic of political psychology, The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialism, which is now an old book, almost 40 years old, Ashish Nandy has argued that the first differentia in colonialism is a state of mind in the colonizers and the colonized, a colonial consciousness. He sets out to explore the psychological contours of colonialism. And he finds that it was congruent with Western sexual stereotypes in which political and socioeconomic dominance symbolized the dominance of men and masculinity over women and femininity. In the first phase of British rule in India under the East India Company, quote, the homology between sexual and political dominance was not central to colonial culture. Rulers and subjects had not yet internalized the idea of colonial rule as a manly or husbandly or lordly prerogative. But after the defeat of the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and the establishment of the Crown Rule under Queen Victoria, mere economic exploitation gave way to colonialism proper, with cultural meanings ascribed to British domination. I just want to read a few lines from The Intimate Enemy to you. Modern colonialism won its great victories not so much through its military and technological prowess, as through its ability to create secular hierarchies incompatible with the traditional order. These hierarchies opened up new vistas for many, particularly for those exploited or cornered within the traditional order. To them, the new order looked like, and here lay its psychological pull, the first step towards a more just and equal world. That was why some of the finest critical minds in Europe and in the East were to feel that colonialism, by introducing modern structures into the barbaric world, would open up the non-West to the modern critical analytical spirit. Like the hideous heathen's god, hideous heathen god who refused to drink nectar except from the skulls of murdered men, while Marx felt history would produce, out of oppression, violence, and cultural dislocation, not merely new technological and social forces, but also a new social consciousness in Asia and Africa. So this was the emancipatory and egalitarian promise of modernity. The shared culture of colonialism bound British rulers and Indian subjects into an unbreakable dyadic relationship. The rulers thought of themselves as naturally superior. The ruled thought of themselves as naturally inferior. Exhibiting what in psychoanalytic terms is called identification with the aggressor, Indians felt emasculated by their political defeat and economic subjugation, and wanted to develop and demonstrate the signs of masculinity that led to British dominance: power, aggression, control, competition, and achievement. These were supposedly the characteristics of manliness that colonial culture valorized and rewarded in the colonizers. Their lack led to humiliation and punishment for the colonized. Once we begin to see that colonial culture assumed a fundamental binary of masculinity, femininity, we notice that what Nandi calls the ideology of sex entailed a series of oppositions: colonizer and colonized, British and Indian, ruler and subject, male and female, adult and child, settler and native, white and colored, mature and juvenile, developed and backward, civilized and savage. The entire grid of binaries is carefully plotted and explained as the psychological infrastructure of colonial consciousness, shared by both sides, and hence perduring, difficult to dislodge even long after decolonization. This rigid framework had no place for complex, hybrid, or fluid identities whether psychosexual, sociobiological, or political, cultural. So, continuing to probe the psychology of colonialism along the vectors of both sex and age, Nandi then shows the damaging impact of this primary masculine-feminine divide, together with the adult-child binary, on the private lives and public personae of prominent colonial intellectuals and early nationalists, especially those from Bengal, such as Raja Ram Mohan Roy, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Michael Madhusudan Dutt, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Swami Vivekananda. He is interested in a psychobiographical comparison of this class of Indian elites with their British counterparts, like Oscar Wilde, Rudyard Kipling, C.F. Andrews, George Orwell, E.M. Forster, and the Bloomsbury Group. He is interested in the psychological processes of identification and alienation, and in what he calls the ideologies of sex, age, and race. Nandi pays particular attention to Indian Anglophone elites, Brown Sahibs, many of whom became the pioneers of the anti-colonial movement and later freedom fighters for Indian independence and leaders of the national movement against British Raj, as well as influential social and religious reformers within Indian society. He also looks at British intellectuals of the ruling class who were in some ways in conflict with the empire and its objectives by being sympathetic to the Indian cause, critical of colonial rapaciousness, and also in some cases themselves mavericks or misfits within European society, as homosexuals, for example. When a self-serving, quote, civilizing mission helped to justify colonialism for some, for others, liberal values were fundamentally at odds with imperialist ideology. In Nandi's analysis, the two major psychological categories or classificatory principles which gave stratificatory structure to the ideology of colonialism were sex and age. As a response to the growing might of the British Empire and the defeat of the Indian resistance in 1857, many Indian writers began to seek powerful symbols in their own history, mythology, and literature to provide some sense of pride, self-respect, and the confidence that they were capable of defending themselves against the colonizers. Michael Madhusudan Dutt's epic, Meghnad Vad Kavya, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Gopal Krishna Gokhale's histories of Chhatrapati Shivaji with his Maratha dynasty, seeking to establish Hindutva Swaraj, and Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's novel Anand Math, with its story based on the Sannyasi rebellion of the late 18th century, as well as his presentation of Sri Krishna in his Krishna Charitra as the diplomat, statesman, and philosopher of the Bhagavad Gita. These are all examples of the early turn to models of strength, masculinity, and preparedness for war in the sphere of cultural production. Swami Vivekananda, who died young at the beginning of the 20th century, wanted Hindus to infuse their faith with both physical prowess and intellectual clarity, drawing on age-old ideals of male asceticism. He reinvigorated the disciplines of Vedanta and yoga that had traditionally been the exclusive domain of Brahmin men for the historical context of colonialism. Thus, many first-generation Indian nationalists saw themselves as revolutionaries, terrorists, and staunch advocates of Swadeshi, a nativist political philosophy of self-reliance and self-respect that rejected all things imposed by the white man, including foreign goods. This brand of anti-colonialism did not shrink from using violent methods of protest and resistance, fighting the colonizers on their terms, trying to be tough and macho to overcome a sense of degradation. Masculinity, bodily strength, the force of arms, fearlessness, the willingness for self-sacrifice and martyrdom in service of the country, and the desire to protect and defend the nation, imagined as Mother India, was to be developed, a counter to the feelings of effete or effeminate weakness, passivity, and defeat that colonialism created in the minds of the colonized. But with World War I, it became clear that modern nationalism and its concomitant warfare had now attained levels of military and technological might that could not be met by small groups of rebel fighters against the mighty British Empire. The Swadeshi phase of Indian nationalism ended. The waning of the early phase of the Swadeshi movement in the first decade of the 20th century, with an important thinker like Rabindranath Tagore expressing his doubts about militant nationalism in his novel Ghare Baire, The Home and the World, and his nephew, the artist Abanindranath Tagore, making his painting of Banga Mata, Mother Bengal, or Bharat Mata, Mother India, as a softly hued icon of maternal care and nurture, rather than a fierce goddess of war and weaponry, changed the tenor of anti-colonial discourse. Rabindranath saw that resorting to religious nationalism, whether Hindu or Muslim, only allowed the colonial state to divide Indians along communal lines, as was first seen in the first partition of Bengal in 1905. Patriotic slogans like Vande Mataram and Bharat Mata Ki Jai could act as a double-edged sword, on the one hand signaling Indian opposition to British authorities, but on the other hand providing a limited idea of who were the legitimate offspring of this Mother India and who could at best count as stepchildren. Tagore followed up his novel with 3 essays strongly criticizing nationalism as an ideology that was globally ascendant, and he addressed these essays to India, Japan, and the United States. He excoriated all 3 nations, which was a bold move in the time of World War I. 3 decades after Tagore's early critique of nationalism, Jawaharlal Nehru, in his classic text of nationalism, The Discovery of India, asks, who is Bharat Mata? Who is Mother India? For him, this abstract figure of the country as a mother or a map morphs into the very people of India. The millions of eyes that look back into his eyes as he makes his campaign speeches in 1936-37, the millions of hands that are raised to greet him as he travels all over the land. Bharat Mata is the body politic as such, what later becomes, in the preamble of the Indian Constitution, we the people of India. Belonging and attachment, nature and nurture, sharing and caring are all perfectly embodied in this feminine form. In the mother's heart, there is place for everyone. According to Nandi, it was Mahatma Gandhi entering the stage of Indian nationalism in 1919 who disrupted the binaristic scheme of masculine-feminine through a psychologically astute deployment of androgyny in his anti-colonial politics of nonviolence. He strategically fused masculine and feminine elements in his personality, drawing on androgynous references widely available in traditional Hinduism, eventually leading the way to decolonization. He also upset the hierarchies of maturity, sometimes using his old age and at other times a childlike demeanor to disarm the adult discourse of the colonial power. Gandhi was an old man who had seen the worst of politics, but still retained to the very end the guileless smile and heartfelt laughter of an innocent child. Gandhi called himself a mother to young relatives like his orphaned grandniece, Manu, who came to live with him in his final years and took care of him through the most stressful chapters of partition violence, leading up to his brutal killing in January 1948. Why can a man not have maternal feelings, he asked. So, in Western culture, masculinity, Nandi explains this, was always seen as preferable to femininity and stronger and more powerful. But in Indian culture, according to Nandi, many other possibilities also existed. So for instance, there is an androgynous version of the god Shiva who is half man and half woman, which, according to Nandi, indicates a symbol of androgyny and a glorification of androgyny, a celebration of androgyny, of the masculine elements within the feminine and the feminine elements within the masculine, that are allowed and manifest themselves in various cultural, religious, and social practices. Gandhi actually made use of this, taking away the idea of impotence or being effete, and rather transferring the strength of androgyny to sort of foreground it, and playing with the masculine-feminine binary. Gandhi turned to multiple religious traditions, including Hinduism, Jainism, and Christianity, to find the moral and spiritual resources for his struggle. He also drew inspiration from modern creeds of what might be thought of as the counterculture: the American transcendentalism of Thoreau and Emerson, the Russian transcendentalism of Tolstoy, 19th century English critics of industrial civilization like Carlyle and Ruskin. He advocated empathy rather than aggression, tolerance rather than confrontation, humility rather than domination, mastery over oneself rather than conquest over the other, truth rather than victory. So there are some technical terms there which I'm familiar with. In my book written some years ago, I described Gandhi's appearance on the Indian political screen stage as a sort of Galilean moment in changing the direction of Indian politics. And I contend that he made an epistemological breakthrough, a Galilean paradigm shift. And this came through his work, his manifesto, Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule, in 1909. Gandhi proposed Hind Swaraj as the answer to British Raj. But in his conception, this was not going to be merely the replacement of English rule by Indian rule, because Gandhi insisted that that we think carefully about this category of Swaraj. It is Swaraj, he wrote, when we learn to rule ourselves. In order to do this, we have to think carefully about both parts of this term Swaraj. That is to say, Swa having to do with the self, and Raj having to do with sovereignty. First, we have to answer the question, who or what is the self? And then we may turn to the problem of rule. Is Swaraj rule of the self, rule over the self, or rule by the self? How can we understand what form this rulership is to take if we have no knowledge about the self in the first place? In order for the Indian self, which could be thought of as individual or collective, both levels are simultaneously present in Gandhi's conceptualization, to face and fight the colonizer, it cannot answer violence with counter-violence, because the adversary is much more powerful in every way, whether politically, economically, or technologically. So trying to challenge the colonial state on its own terms is to fight from a position of disadvantage and to be certain of defeat. Gandhi therefore advocated a completely unprecedented form of response to colonial violence, and this was non-violence, or ahimsa. What is ahimsa? To address ahimsa, we have to look at himsa. In Sanskrit, himsa is hantum ichha, that's the derivation, the desire or the intention to harm, injure, hurt, or kill. With the negation of this desire within the self, ahimsa, we get rid of that fundamental instinct to destroy the other. We are now in a position not of weakness, but of a hitherto unexpected form of strength. We must face what Gandhi called in Gujarati top bal or baju bal, that is to say, the force of the cannon and the force of arms, with atma bal, the strength of the self, and daya bal, the strength of forgiveness. In other words, we must counter what he called brute force with what he called soul force. This soul force is what Gandhi named Satyagrah, holding steadfast to that which is right and true, Satya. As we know from our national motto, the Indian national motto taken from an Upanishad, the Mundaka Upanishad, Satyam eva jayate, that is to say, truth alone is that which prevails or conquers or is victorious. In English, Satyagrah is sometimes translated as passive resistance, which is not as effective as soul force. Because in passive resistance, we see an emphasis on passivity in the face of an active onslaught of the enemy. And resistance assumes a meaning of being fixed in one position. On the other hand, soul force suggests that even something insubstantial like the soul, our very being, the swa of Swaraj, has the capacity to exercise force or bal, that is, to have an effect on the circumstances in which we find ourselves. We can actively change the situation we are in. We have agency. We are inherently capable. Because remember that the origin of this force is at the level of our very intention, ichha, from which we have removed or withheld or negated the killer instinct. Rather, whatever the provocation or threat, whatever the punishment or injustice, we hold fast to the truth, satya. That is satyagrah. Together, then, these absolutely novel Gandhian ideas, the weapons of the weak, so to speak, Swaraj, Ahimsa, and Satyagrah, came to define a new courage and to give direction to a new anti colonial struggle, one which became impossible for the British to suppress or defeat because Gandhi had changed the rules of engagement. As is well known, Gandhiji drew his strength from a number of sources, including spiritual practice and religious faith. We can think of charkha, the spinning wheel, the Gandhian spinning wheel, and khadi, the hand-spun cloth, fasting and walking, cleaning toilets, and collective prayer, all as techniques for building up the inner resources necessary to confront an adversary who was vastly more powerful than the self. Crucially, by bringing Swaraj and Swadeshi into the hands and homes of the people, into their minds and bodies, Gandhi was able to include and involve women in the freedom struggle. The first political mass movements that Indian women took part in were the civil disobedience, salt satyagrah, and Quit India campaigns led by Gandhi. These large-scale mobilizations of even the female half of the population are what paved the way for electoral democracy and universal adult franchise at the time of independence. But for our purposes of looking at religious nationalism and the role of religion, I want to point to two figures who were central to Gandhi's efforts at building up Atma Bal, soul force, or inner strength. These were Sri Krishna and Sri Rama. Gandhiji read a section of the Bhagavad Gita every single day with his ashram associates. Once they had read through the 18 chapters over several days, he started once again from the beginning. Think carefully about why Gandhiji read and discussed a discourse about necessary violence and filial duty conducted between Krishna and Arjuna on the battlefield of Kurukshetra at the very moment before the opening of the Mahabharata war in order to develop his theory of ahimsa, non-violence. This was because what Krishna was trying to teach Arjuna was not himsa or violence, but rather kartavya or duty, not conquest, but courage. This was the very lesson that the Mahatma hoped Indians would use in their battle for Swaraj. We do not want English rule without the Englishmen, he said. It is Swaraj when we learn to rule ourselves. While Hind Swaraj is one way to name the goal of the freedom struggle, that is to say, Indian self-rule, Gandhiji often described his ideal of sovereignty, again in opposition to British Raj, as Ram Raj. Now, what did he mean by this? Ram Raj in traditional understandings, is the most just of kingdoms, ruled by the most perfect of kings, Raja Ram himself. Ram, who is an avatar of Vishnu on earth and is the ruler of the kingdom of Ayodhya. Gandhiji wanted to evoke through this term, Ram Rajya, which millions of common people readily understood, a benign home rule as opposed to the ruthless colonial state. In his daily prayers, in his daily ashram prayers, so you see, this is the sort of field of terminology that Gandhi is resetting through his idea of Swaraj. Replace British Raj with Swaraj, and the idealized form of self-rule. For that, he drew on traditional understandings available from the Ramayana, which was widely understood by the people as the perfect kingdom, Ram Rajya. In his daily ashram prayers, called the Bhajanavali, he included a number of songs which many of us still know, all of which are about Ram. Shri Ramachandra Kripalu Bhajaman, which is actually a poem by Tulsidas, who wrote the 17th century epic of the Ramayana as the Ramcharitmanas. Raghupati Raghav Raja Ram, the so-called Ram Dhun. These are all sort of commonly understood as Gandhian lyrics, Gandhian poems, Gandhian songs, and so on. Vaishnav Janto Teni Kahiye, a poem by the medieval Gujarati poet, saint poet Narsi Mehta, and so on. When he was assassinated on January 30th, 1948, by the Hindu extremist Nathuram Godse, the last words to leave his lips were, Hey Ram, O God, right? And that is the stone at the site of his assassination at Birla House in Delhi. This was on January 30th, 1948, just about 6 months after independence and partition. So Ram for Gandhi was an embodiment of Kripa. Kripa would be, the kindness, the charity, the forgiveness of God, daya, karuna, compassion, udarta, generosity, and a true Vaishnav, that is to say, a true believer in Rama or Krishna, was one who understood the pain of others, Je Peed Parai Jane, right? That's from Vaishnav Janto, who recognized the humanity of the most downtrodden, Patit Pavan, Deen Dayalu, and so many other expressions of divine compassion, empathy, love, and care. So whether as a god or a king, Ram for Gandhi was nothing if not Kripa Sindhu, that is to say, the ocean of compassion, Karuna Nidhan, the repository of empathy, and so on. As Tulsidas has sung in his Vinay Patrika, I'm sorry if these are not familiar to some people in the audience, Aso ko dar jagmahi, Binu sevajo drave deen par Ram saris ko nahi. Who in the whole world is as giving, as generous as Ram? Even if they do not serve him, he nevertheless pours his grace upon the meek. There is no one compares with him. So the reason I'm dwelling on Gandhi's Ram is to actually differentiate him from Ram, who is understood as the centerpiece of Hindu nationalist ideology today. So Gandhiji chanted every day Raghupati Raghav Raja Ram, Patit Pavan Sita Ram, Ishwar Allah Tero Naam, Sabko Sanmati De Bhagwan, right? So this is the scion of the house of Raghu, Lord Ram, lifting up those who have fallen, Sita and Ram, king and queen, god and goddess. Ishwar and Allah are both names for you, right? So God is one. May God grant everyone his true wisdom. Gandhiji, who said, God has no religion. I am a Hindu, I am also a Muslim, I am a Christian, a Buddhist, and a Jew. Gandhiji, who was a Vaishnav Banya, with a Jain spiritual preceptor, Srimad Rajchandra, Gandhiji, for whom Ram Nam, the name of the Lord, was Satya itself, truth itself, not a ground for division, hatred, othering, and himsa, hantum ichha, the desire to hurt or kill. But as Nandi warns right at the beginning of his argument, today, almost 80 years after the formal end of the Raj and the emergence of India and Pakistan through independence and partition in 1947, the ideology of colonialism is still triumphant in many sectors of life. In contemporary India, Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, modeled on colonial ideology, reinstates hypermasculinity and majoritarianism to mainstream politics. Gandhi is caricatured as passive and ineffective, while his critics and killers in the Hindu right are once again glorified. Colonial binaries now grafted onto communal discourse show Muslims as violent and powerful, and Hindus as non-violent and effete, a historical wrong, supposedly, that has to be righted by reversing the roles of the two religious groups. In the Hindutva worldview, Gandhi's passionate advocacy of nonviolence is often directly blamed for partition, the successful, if terribly violent, creation of a separate homeland for South Asian Muslims, that is to say, Pakistan, at the time of decolonization. The rise of Hindu nationalism over 4 decades now, at least since the early 90s, or I would say since 1980 actually, has relied on a reinvention of the very Hindu gods Ram and Krishna. Ram is no longer an unhappy prince in exile, whose stepmother plotted to unthrone him and whose young wife has been abducted, but a warrior of superhuman strength going into battle with the demon king Ravan. That is to say, there has been a weaponization of the epic Ramayana. The message for Hindus is to embrace the masculine behaviors of aggression and assertion to protect themselves from or to dominate Muslims, to show them their place in India, redefined as a Hindu Rashtra, a Hindu nation. Hindutva targets specifically those elements, whether in Gandhi, who is the father of the nation, or Ram, who is the divine king and the ideal sovereign in the Hindu epic. So Hindutva targets those very elements in both these figures, whether in Gandhi or in Ram, that are perceived as effeminate or even to some extent androgynous. These revered figures are undermined for supposedly weakening the national community of Indians and the religious community of Hindus. Thus today, everywhere we see images of our gods and goddesses armed and dangerous. With Krishna, we notice a gradual erasure and negation of feminine elements. So in traditional Vaishnav belief and representation, Krishna was a young boy, a cowherd, embedded in a pastoral landscape, sporting and frolicking among women like his mother, his foster mother Yashoda, his beloved Radha, and his friends, girls and boys, who embodied the innocence, affection, and playfulness of childhood. In other texts, we see the adult Krishna of the Mahabharata, who never takes up arms but serves as a philosophical guide to Arjuna, emphasizing wisdom over violence. The representation of Krishna as a strategic thinker, diplomat, and a theorist of war began in the 19th century, as I mentioned, as a response to colonial oppression. But today's Krishna is more likely to wield his deadly Sudarshan Chakra or rise up in the towering shape of an all-consuming Kal, time, than play his cowherd's flute or dally with his shy playmate Radha and her girlfriends in a sylvan forest by the Yamuna. Hanuman, from being a devoted servant of Ram and Sita, has turned into a snarling simian who can leap across oceans and burn down the enemy's citadel with a flick of his tail. Deities who in any case have aspects of ferocity and destruction already present in their iconography, like Shiva and Durga, are now much more likely to have their stotras be rendered in death metal and their representations appear in the most outlandish and grotesque styles of manga and anime. Virility, vengeance, venom, and vitriol our gods, our heroes, our saviors, and our soulmates are becoming ever more frightening, pumped up on testosterone. There appears to be a return of the colonial psychology of gender and power in these times of religious nationalism and populist majoritarianism in India. Gandhi's nonviolence, Tagore's pluralism, Nehru's secularism, and Ambedkar's egalitarianism, all foundational ideals of the Indian Republic, have been attacked frontally by the Hindu right. What was until the advent of Hindutva seen as India's signature strength, that is, tolerance of ritual, of religious and cultural diversity, is now tarred as its fatal weakness, its propensity to be trampled over for centuries by colonizers, invaders, and conquerors of all types. No wonder the rewriting of India's history has become the key battleground between secular and religious nationalists. This time, the adversary is identified not as the white colonizer, but as the enemy within, the Muslim. Despite partition, Muslims constitute India's largest minority, at 12 to 14% of the population. And you know now India is the world's most populated country. And their numbers match or exceed the total populations of the world's largest Muslim majority countries, whether Pakistan, Indonesia, or Malaysia. But murderous Hindu supremacists exhibit what Arjun Appadurai has called the fear of small numbers that constitutes the majoritarian, hyper-nationalist, and xenophobic reflex everywhere seen in the etiology of modern hate. What we need to understand is how the right-wing politics of majoritarianism does violence to habits of accommodation and coexistence that have evolved over time within all major religious traditions, and harms this politics harms the rights of minorities of all types, whether seen from the lens of religion or that of gender. Patriarchy, misogyny, sexual violence, and gender-based discrimination seem to go hand in hand with religious fundamentalism and neo-nationalism. So I just wanted to conclude now by returning to some of Nandi's arguments. The trauma of colonialism is so fundamentally damaging, as Ashish Nandi has shown, because it locks both colonizer and colonized into a reciprocally and reflexively wounding dynamic of intimate enmity. Violence that is inflicted on the victim also simultaneously rebounds on the oppressor, leading to the violent repression of the very parts of the self that are most like the other. Conversely, the colonial victim too disavows what is experienced as the lack, weakness, and failure within the self that make it vulnerable, and instead tries to shore itself up by identifying with and mimicking the arrogance and aggression of the colonizing other. Both parties are not just locked into antagonistic confrontation with one another, but also estranged from those aspects of themselves that would have brought about a rapprochement, or perhaps more, perhaps even mutual love. It takes Gandhi to break this cycle, Nandi argues, because he is the one to see clearly that the more dangerous violence lies within. If violence is the intention to harm, non-violence is the elimination of such an intention. But intentionality presupposes an object towards which the effects of an action, in this context, a harmful action, are aimed. So Gandhi's insight into the self-directed sting in the tail of other-directed violence leads him to engage in a more difficult struggle, which is to stop the harm to oneself that colonizer and colonized both fail to recognize in the engulfing colonial situation, pitting them against each other as irreconcilable and enemies. Gandhi's nonviolent resistance turns out to be the only effective weapon against colonial rule. And I just want to read a little bit, one last bit from Nandi, just to sum up this argument, where he says, beg your pardon. It has become obvious the drive for mastery over men is not merely a byproduct of a faulty political economy, but also of a world view which believes in the absolute superiority of the human over the non-human and the subhuman, the masculine over the feminine, the adult over the child, the historical over the ahistorical, and the modern or progressive over the traditional or the savage. It has become more and more apparent that genocides, eco-disasters, and ethnocides are but the underside of corrupt sciences and psychopathic technologies wedded to new secular hierarchies which have reduced major civilizations to the status of a set of empty rituals. The ancient forces of human greed and violence, once one recognizes, have merely found a new legitimacy in anthropocentric doctrines of secular salvation, in the ideologies of progress, normality, and hypermasculinity, and in theories of cumulative growth in science and technology. I hope, he says, modern oppression as opposed to traditional oppression is a battle between dehumanized self and the objectified enemy. The technologized bureaucrat and his reified victim, pseudo-rulers and their fearsome other selves projected onto their subjects. That is the difference between the Crusades and Auschwitz, between Hindu-Muslim riots and modern warfare. This is why the following pages speak only of victims. When they speak of victors, the victors are ultimately shown to be camouflaged victims at an advanced stage of psychosocial decay. I hope, he says, shown that the liberation ultimately had to begin from the colonized and end with the colonizers. As Gandhi was to so clearly formulate through his own life, freedom is indivisible, not only in the popular sense of the oppressed of the world, that the oppressed of the world are one, but also in the unpopular sense that the oppressor too is caught in the culture of oppression. I'll just stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ananya, for that presentation. There's so many resonances in what you say in the world that we see around us today.